Poisoned fish, a desperate crew starving for fresh food, and a mysterious island rising from the sea. As the Resolution leaves New Caledonia behind, Georg Forster reflects on the people they have just encountered, peaceful, reserved, and living in a harsh land that offers little to survive on. Voyage to go, history. Life is a journey, being part of it is everything. Hello, my name is Jessica. In this podcast, I explore historical journeys and travel accounts that shaped how Europeans came to understand the world. This series follows the second voyage of Captain James Cook and the young naturalist Georg Forster through the Pacific in the 18th century. What happened in the last episode? The expedition remained anchored along the harsh coast of New Caledonia, while illness from poisoned reef fish weakened the naturalists. Despite their condition, they continued exploring the plains, swamps, and villages, observing a people living with scarce resources. Meanwhile, a small expedition to nearby Balabia revealed friendly encounters and sudden suspicion. Saturday, September 17th, 1774, New Caledonia.
At daybreak, they weighed anchor. Soon they had passed the reefs and were steering northwest along the coast. Their stay in this harbor had lasted just 8.5 days, but already on the third day, the travelers had been poisoned and rendered unable to make use of the remaining time, as they had hoped. Even upon departure, they were far from fully recovered. They still suffered from intense headaches and cramp-like pains throughout the body, along with a rash on the lips. Their strength was barely enough to carry out the minor duties they usually performed at sea. The lack of good, fresh food also did nothing to help restore their health. And so the travelers departed from an island in the westernmost part of the Southern Ocean, only about 12 degrees from New Holland. Its people were extraordinarily different from any other known South Sea islanders. From its proximity to New Holland, one might have assumed a connection to its inhabitants. But based on the reports of all previous travelers who had visited New Holland, there was not the slightest resemblance between the people of these two lands. This was further confirmed by the complete dissimilarity of their languages. The travelers were able to verify this in detail, since Captain Cook had provided them with a dictionary of the New Holland language.
In the 18th century, Georg Forster referred to what we now call Australia as New Holland. To him, it was a largely unknown land with coasts partly explored by the Dutch and the British, while its interior remained mysterious. The inhabitants, the Aborigines, he described according to the knowledge of his time as hunter-gatherers without agriculture, using simple tools and living without permanent settlements. He saw them as distinctly different from the peoples of Polynesia and Melanesia. Today, we know that the Aborigines are descendants of the first humans who arrived in Australia and New Guinea more than 50,000 years ago. They are genetically closely related to the indigenous people of New Guinea. This shared ancestry dates back to a time when Australia and New Guinea were still connected by a land bridge. The people of New Caledonia, the Kanaks, descend from a later Austronesian migration that began around 3,000 years ago. However, they also carry ancient Papuan genes, linking them to the Aborigines in a distant past. So today we understand what Forster once saw as entirely different peoples are, in fact, connected through ancient common roots.
The population of New Caledonia did not seem large. Based on observations made while sailing along the northern coast, it was estimated that along a stretch of about 370 kilometers, there were no more than 50,000 inhabitants. Much of the land appeared barren. The narrow plain at the foot of the mountains was heavily marshy toward the sea and covered in mangroves. Preparing a patch for cultivation required laborious digging and draining. The rest of the plain lay slightly higher, but was so dry that ditches had to be dug and filled with water from streams or puddles. Further inland, the mountains and hills bore only a thin layer of burnt, infertile soil. Only some sparse types of grass grew there, along with the cajeput tree and isolated shrubs. On the higher peaks, there was at times not even a centimeter of soil, only bare, iron-rich mica, and large pieces of quartz. Such terrain offered plants little chance to thrive. It was all the more surprising that the travelers still found a great variety of plants, even if most appeared dry and stunted. Only in certain parts of the lowlands were the forests dense, filled with underbrush, vines, beautiful flowers, and shady trees. The contrast with the New Hebrides, which they had visited just before and found rich in lush vegetation, must have been particularly striking. The difference in the character of the people was just as notable. While almost all the inhabitants of the South Sea Islands, except those Tasman encountered on Tongatabu and Namaka, had tried to drive away their foreign visitors, the people of New Caledonia welcomed them immediately as friends. With no sign of fear or mistrust, they came aboard the ship and allowed the strangers to roam freely through their land. Their woolly hair and skin color most closely resembled the people of Tanna, yet they were taller, more powerfully built, and had gentler, more open and peaceful facial expressions. Their craftsmanship also showed similarities with that of the Tannese, especially in the shape and type of weapons, slings, and jewelry. The language, however, was entirely different from the one spoken in Tanna. Likewise, the construction of houses, customs, traditions, and overall way of life differed greatly. Compared to the people of New Caledonia, the Tannese could be considered wealthy. Their plantations yielded abundant crops, and where those were lacking, the coastline offered many coconut palms. In contrast, the agricultural yield in New Caledonia was poor, and the vast, wild land, as far as the travelers could explore it, seemed to offer nothing of special use. However, the people were better fishermen, and the reefs off their coast were excellent for fishing. Turtles likely also appeared there during certain times of the year. It was precisely because nature was so sparing in its gifts here that it was even more astonishing that the inhabitants were less wild, mistrustful, and warlike than those of Tanna, and instead appeared peaceful and kind-hearted. Equally remarkable was that, despite the dry land and limited plant-based food supply, they were of larger and more muscular build than the Tannese. Perhaps this difference in physique was less due to diet and more to differences in tribal and ancestral lineage. The behavior of the people of New Caledonia reflected very positively on their character. They were the only people in the South Seas who had no reason to be displeased with the presence of Europeans. It was sadly all too well known how quickly sailors tended to take the lives of indigenous people. Considering that these locals had not caused the visitors the slightest discomfort, let alone given reason for violence, one could only conclude that they were remarkably gentle and peace-loving. Philosophers who attempt to explain a people's character, customs, and nature solely based on climate would find themselves puzzled here. If one were to claim that the people knew no mistrust because they had little to lose, the question remained why the people of New Holland, under the same skies, on equally dry soil, and in even poorer conditions, were instead described as wild and shy. The difference in the character of these peoples must therefore stem from many different factors that had influenced them continuously over long periods. The peaceful nature of the people of New Caledonia certainly wasn't due to complete ignorance of war and enmity, for they possessed various types of weapons. They themselves admitted to having enemies and explained that the inhabitants of the island of Minga were of a very different character. Once, Georg was in a boat with Captain Cook and Mr. Wales when one of the New Caledonians clearly indicated that there were enemies who ate human flesh. The behavior of the people of Belabia, who believed the salted meat the Europeans were eating before their eyes to be human flesh, sufficiently proved that they knew of such customs and considered them horrifying and repulsive. In that respect, they were more civilized than their wealthier neighbors. Yet they were not so enlightened that they had, like some other island peoples, already abandoned the unjust devaluation of the other sex. They were too serious to be swayed by its flattery, and too indifferent to value the finer pleasures of life. Although they sometimes had to labor hard for their livelihood, once that concern was taken care of, they spent their free hours in idleness, without play or jest, things that so greatly contribute to human happiness, and that spread so much cheer and vitality among the inhabitants of the Society and Friendly Islands. Apart from a small pipe that had already been mentioned, the travelers saw no musical instruments among them. Nor was it known whether or to what extent they practiced dance or song. Based on their short stay, even laughter seemed to be a rare occurrence, and in speech they were reserved. It was rare to meet someone with whom one could hold a longer conversation. Under such circumstances, their language was likely still very undeveloped, and, probably due to a lack of practice, their pronunciation was unclear. Various word lists compiled by the ship's crew therefore differed noticeably. Although their language contained few harsh consonants, they spoke heavily through the throat and nose, which made them particularly difficult for those Europeans who only knew English to understand, let alone imitate. Perhaps they were unaccustomed to speaking simply because their homes were scattered and far apart. Had it been otherwise, they might already have developed more of a sense and taste for the joy of social interaction. Since the soil was poorly suited for agriculture, the best way to promote the civilization of these people seemed to be by introducing easy-to-keep four-footed livestock, such as pigs, which could be kept near their huts, or goats, which could be left to roam freely. The latter, in particular, would likely thrive in the dry climate and become a valuable part of their lives. The simplicity evident in the domestic lives of the inhabitants likely also extended to their political order. Teabuma was considered the leader of the district opposite the travelers' anchorage, but given the poverty of the land, he could hardly claim any special privileges, and with no luxury to speak of, he probably lived no better than his fellow countrymen. The signs of honor shown to him were minor. The only indication of some degree of hierarchy was that the gifts distributed by Mr. Pickersgill during the first encounter were always handed over to him. Even the name they gave him could be considered a form of honor. The word tea seemed to be a title placed before the name of any respected man. For instance, Hibai called the captain tea cook when he wanted to show him special respect. The neighboring districts were not under Teabuma's authority, but likely had their own leaders, or rather, each family formed a small kingdom of its own, led patriarchally by the eldest. This matched the early stage of development common to all human communities. The travelers could say very little about the people's religion during their 8-day stay. Not a trace of any religious practice was observed, let alone formal ceremonies or signs of superstition. Likely, the simplicity of their beliefs matched the simplicity of their overall character. However, the simple monuments at their graves may have indicated some kind of burial rite. Death, after all, is a significant event everywhere, usually honored with outward displays, with mourning often tipping into excess. What fatal diseases existed in the land, and how high the mortality rate was, remained unknown. The only condition the travelers observed was the frequent occurrence of elephantiasis. However, none of the cases was severe enough to pose an immediate threat to life. Many diseases arise from indulgence and excess, something that could hardly occur among such a poor and simple people. Gray hair and wrinkles, the usual signs of old age, were not uncommon here. Still, it was impossible to communicate with the locals about the abstract concept of age. Even if it had been possible, it remained doubtful whether they could have given their ages at all. Not even among the Tahitians, whose language the travelers knew much better, had they been able to ask about life expectancy. And here they had picked up only a handful of words. The travelers now steered between north and west along the rocky reefs surrounding this part of New Caledonia. Their aim was to trace the course of the coastline, which appeared to extend in that direction. Near the island of Balabia, the reef stretched northward, at times lying up to 11 kilometers from the shore. Frigate birds, boobies, and tropic birds circled the ship in large numbers.
Friday, September 15, 1774, western tip of New Caledonia, southwestern Pacific.
On September 15th, they discovered that 3 islands lay to the north of the western end of New Caledonia. However, the reef extended far eastward of these islands into the sea, and no opening could be seen through which one might sail in, so the shape and size of the islands remained uncharted. They estimated the largest to be about 13 kilometers long. On the same day, only about 7 kilometers from the reef, they were caught in a calm. The high waves drove the ship straight toward the rocks. The danger was so great that 2 boats were immediately deployed, and their crews laboriously pulled the ship away from the cliffs using ropes. A light breeze in the evening brought some relief, but at midnight they had to resume working in shifts to stay afloat.
Sailors! Quickest men than sailors!
The following morning was so calm that they took the small boat out for bird hunting, but with little success. Eventually, a fresh wind picked up in the evening. Since they had so far searched in vain for a passage through the reef at the northern end, the captain ordered the ship to turn around and sail directly back around the southeastern tip of New Caledonia. The northernmost point they had seen lay at 19 degrees 37 minutes south latitude and 163 degrees 40 minutes east longitude. The next morning, they sailed once more past the district of Ballad, where the ship had previously been anchored. Due to frequent calms, the journey was tedious and frustrating. In 2 days, they covered only 37 kilometers, and since the coastline stretched much farther south, they feared they would arrive late in New Zealand, from where, according to plan, they were to make one final voyage toward the South Pole. Nevertheless, they continued their route east and south, however weak and intermittent the wind blew. On the evening of September 22nd, they sighted a blunt promontory jutting out into the sea, which they named Coronation Cap, in honor of the Coronation Day. The reefs along the northern coast did not extend this far, but they kept a safe distance of 7 to 9 kilometers from the shore. As a result, they couldn't discern the coastline in detail, but it was clear through the spyglass that the inland mountain range remained as high as it had been at the anchorage. In the morning, they discovered thick smoke rising from a strip of land at least 800 meters long. Nearby, the coastline was covered with countless tall, column-like formations, clearly visible through the telescope. Some stood alone and far apart, but most were densely clustered in large groups. The travelers assumed these were basalt columns, like those found in many parts of the world. This seemed all the more likely since they had recently seen various volcanoes in this part of the South Seas, including one on Tanna, and experienced mineralogists believed basalt was formed by volcanic activity. By evening, they had reached the other side of Coronation Cap and saw more large clusters of these columns on a flat promontory extending far out into the sea.
Saturday, September 24th, 1774, Queen Charlotte's Foreland.
In the morning, they sighted the cape marking the eastern end of New Caledonia. It was steep but not very high, with a completely flat top. A number of the same columns stood on this plateau, though this didn't necessarily confirm they were basalt. This headland, which Captain Cook named Queen Charlotte's Foreland, lies at 22 degrees 15 minutes south latitude and 167 degrees 15 minutes east longitude. Around 6 p.m., someone in the crow's nest spotted another island far to the southeast. The next morning, several smaller islets appeared between this island and New Caledonia. However, the unsteady wind prevented them from exploring further. They only observed that the islands were surrounded by a large reef. Since no opening could be found, they were forced to steer east to avoid the risk of shipwreck. This part of the voyage was doubly unpleasant. First, the land was so close in sight, yet they couldn't explore it. Second, they suspected there might be fresh provisions ashore, but none could be obtained. The remaining stock of yams was very low and reserved as a delicacy for the officers' tables, while the common sailors hadn't had a single bite of fresh food since Namaka. The nearness of the land made the continued fasting all the harder to endure for the men. And for the travelers, too, it was frustrating to drift idly along the barren reefs instead of making discoveries ashore. The wind, however, seemed to take no notice of their impatience, and remained weak until the evening of the 26th, when it finally picked up and helped them sail around the largest of the islands ahead. This island consisted of a mountain, not as high as those of New Caledonia, rising gently and surrounded by a plain covered in countless column-like formations. Several times, they had to tack at a distance of about 3.7 kilometers from shore, which brought them close enough to finally solve the mystery of the supposed basalt columns. They were nothing more than trees with very straight, tall trunks and short, thin branches that could not be seen from afar.
Wednesday, September 28, 1774, Isle of Pines.
At dawn, they had rounded the easternmost tip of this island and its reefs, and were now sailing along the southern side. Captain Cook named the island Isle of Pines, assuming that the column-like trees might belong to that genus. The island appeared to have a circumference of about 33 kilometers, and its center lay at 22 degrees 40 minutes south latitude and 167 degrees 40 minutes east longitude. The fresh southeast wind cooled the air at this latitude so much that the thermometer dropped to 20 degrees Celsius. For the crew, long accustomed to constant heat, this change in temperature was especially noticeable. The next day, they found a passage through various reefs and dropped anchor in front of a small island, barely more than 3.7 kilometers in circumference, sandy and flat but densely overgrown with those column-like trees. The southern end of New Caledonia's mainland lay only about 11 kilometers away, and since the southern coast seemed to run parallel to the northern one, it was presumed that New Caledonia must be a rather narrow strip of land. This headland was named Prince of Wales Foreland, and lies at 22 degrees 30 minutes south latitude and 166 degrees 58 minutes east longitude. Hardly had the anchors been secured when they rowed in a boat to the nearest shore, about 2.8 kilometers away. The island was surrounded by its own small reef, in which they found a narrow passage and navigated it safely despite the rocks. The slender, tall trees immediately drew attention upon landing. They were a type of cypress, growing beautifully straight to heights of at least 27 to 30 meters. The branches grew all around the trunk, but were rarely more than 3 meters long and very thin compared to the trunk. Among these column trees stood many other trees and low shrubs, making this small island a delightful refuge for many bird species. They also found some scurvy grass and a type of tetragonia, which they had often used as soup greens during their earlier stay in New Zealand. After an initial survey, they returned to the ship to eat, then landed again to fell a few trees for the carpenters and gather culinary herbs. During this second visit, they discovered a surprising variety of plant species, considering the island's small size. On the beach, they found traces of fire in the sand and remains of turtles. While collecting plants, they shot a hawk of the species Falco haliaitos and a flycatcher of a completely new genus. There were also several kinds of large, beautiful pigeons, but these were so shy that no one managed to shoot one. Along the coast, they also found numerous flat-tailed sea snakes, Anguis platura. The cypress wood proved to be excellent for construction, and the young trunks were so elastic they were well suited for use as sail spars. After staying until sunset, they returned to the ship, raised anchor at dawn, and sailed slowly and carefully until they had cleared the reef. Captain Cook named the island Botany Island because, despite its small size, it contained a flora of nearly 30 species, several of which were entirely new. It lay at 22 degrees 28 minutes south latitude and 167 degrees 16 minutes east longitude. The shore was very sandy, but the interior soil was fertile. While they lay at anchor there, the first lieutenant caught a fish of the same kind that had once poisoned Captain Cook, Georg's father, and Georg himself. Even though he had witnessed the effects at the time and his companions warned him seriously, he insisted on having the fish prepared. It even had to be served to him, and his friends could only stop him from eating it by ridiculing his stubborn plan. A young dog, however, who had unfortunately eaten the fish's entrails, suffered so painfully for several days that a sailor eventually threw him overboard out of pity. This incident showed how desperately the crew longed for fresh food if they were willing to risk poisoning for a single meal. All the officers, some of whom had circumnavigated the world more than once and endured much, unanimously stated that the hardships of previous voyages had been nothing compared to this one, and that they had never been so sick of the miserable ship's fare as now. Captain Cook had indeed taken a supply of smoked ham on board, but it had by then deteriorated so badly that the fat had turned rancid, and the salt had crystallized into tartar-like alkaline clumps. Yet, whenever such a half-rotten, foul-smelling ham, which only happened once a week, appeared on the captain's table, the younger officers who didn't eat with him would gaze longingly at this delicacy and consider his dining companions to be lucky men. It was probably thanks to the sauerkraut on board alone that scurvy didn't spread more severely. But even without that disease, their circumstances were already miserable and lamentable enough. In the evening, they ran into a calm still inside the reefs. This placed them in great danger, because tide and current pushed the ship toward the cliffs, and even at 150 fathoms, no bottom could be found. In this situation, around 7:30 p.m., they saw a fireball in the northern sky, nearly as large and bright as the sun, though paler in its glow. After a few moments it burst and left behind numerous bright sparks, the largest of which were elongated and rounded and quickly sank below the horizon. A bluish flame followed, marking the path of the fireball. Some claimed they had heard a hissing noise during its fall.
The bright fireball observed by the crew was almost certainly a meteor entering the Earth's atmosphere. When small rocky bodies from space hit the atmosphere at extremely high speed, friction heats them until they glow brightly. Large meteors can appear as blazing balls of light and sometimes explode before reaching the ground. In the 18th century, such events were poorly understood and often interpreted as omens or as signs of coming weather changes. Sailors frequently believed that meteors could bring wind or storms. Modern science shows that meteors and weather are not directly connected. The sudden wind that followed was therefore most likely just coincidence.
While the travelers were still pondering the cause and meaning of this meteor, the sailors spread the joyful prediction that a fresh wind would soon follow. And whether by chance or due to some natural atmospheric connection, this prophecy fulfilled itself that same night. A strong wind arose, which turned southward by the next morning, and allowed them to steer eastward by south and south-southeast, away from New Caledonia.
Saturday, October 1st, 1774, New Caledonia.
This island was the largest among all those discovered so far in the South Seas between the tropics. However, they were completely unable to investigate its southern side, and even from the northern coast, in the short time they could devote to this discovery, they were only able to record its direction and external shape. The animals, plants, and minerals of this land remained almost entirely unknown to them and offered future naturalists a vast field of new discoveries. They noticed cypress trees only at the eastern end of the island, which suggested that the soil and geological composition there were quite different from those in the district of Ballad, where the ship had lain at anchor for 8 days. Likewise, based on what they found on the small sandy Botany Island, one might have assumed that the southern part of New Caledonia contained entirely different plant species and more unknown bird species than the forests of the northern regions. Indeed, numerous discoveries still await future seafarers in the South Seas. Despite all past voyages, there are still wide areas in this quiet ocean that have never been sailed. For example, the entire space between 10 degrees south latitude and the equator, stretching from America to New Britain. Likewise, the area between 10 degrees and 14 degrees south latitude, bordered by 140 degrees and 160 degrees west longitude, or the area between 30 degrees and 20 degrees south latitude and 140 degrees to 175 degrees west longitude. Also, the area between the southernmost Friendly Islands and New Caledonia, as well as the sea between New Caledonia and New Holland, remain unexplored. The course taken by Mr. de Surville is the only one that has been sailed so far between these two lands. Moreover, New Guinea, New Britain, and all surrounding lands deserve closer examination, and would certainly give rise to countless new and important observations for anyone who took the trouble. And even when all these parts of the South Pacific are explored, the area beyond the equator to the north would still remain, whose full exploration would in turn require several voyages. The wind, which the sailors believed was thanks to the recently observed fireball, soon died down again. By October 2nd, there was another calm, but as so often, this too had its benefit. They caught a shark, several of which had appeared near the ship. Within a short time, it was distributed among the entire crew, and oily as the taste of the meat was, they ate their share with great appetite. Who could afford to be picky in their situation? Finally, to everyone's relief, a fresh west wind arose, allowing them to continue their course south-southeast, beyond the southern tropic.
Wednesday, October 5th, 1774, between New Caledonia and New Zealand.
In the afternoon, between the 26th and 27th degrees south latitude, they sighted 2 albatrosses. A calm on the following day was used by several officers to go hunting in a boat. Despite a full day's effort, they returned with only 2 petrels and 2 albatrosses. They were now once again at the boundary of the eastern trade wind, which around this time of year, near the solstice, becomes unstable in the region of the tropic. On the afternoon of October 7th, good wind arose, and they sailed southwest. Captain Cook this time intended to steer directly for the west coast of New Zealand, in order to avoid Cook Strait, whose passage had cost so much time and effort the year before. On the evening of October 8th, a large school of porpoises swam past the ship. They leapt playfully out of the water and circled the ship. One was harpooned and dragged a long length of rope with it until a boat pursued and killed it with 5 musket shots. The animal belonged to the species that even the ancients referred to as dolphin, and which, like the common porpoise, occurs in all seas. It was about 1.83 meters long and had milk in its teats, as it belonged to the class of mammals. The next morning, it was butchered and distributed among the crew. The meat was almost black and looked unappetizing but when stripped of fat, it tasted somewhat like dried beef. At noon, they enjoyed the meal and were very pleased with the catch. Around 8 o'clock in the morning, the lookout sighted land, a small, moderately high island densely covered with cypresses, just like Botany Island. Even at a considerable distance from shore, the sea was only about 37 meters deep. An hour later, they estimated the island's length to be 3 to 5 kilometers. The steep, almost fully forested slopes suggested that the island was uninhabited. The large numbers of seabirds along the coast supported this assumption and gave hope for a fresh meal. After an early and quickly eaten lunch, the captain sent out 2 boats. Between cliffs and rocks that jutted far into the sea, they rowed into a small bay, well protected by those rocks, where the boats could anchor calmly. Large stones lay on the beach, and in some places the land rose almost vertically. Between 2 hills, a small stream trickled down through a rock crevice. Along its banks they climbed and, struggling through a thicket of vines and creepers, entered the forest. Farther up, the forest became more open, and the path more pleasant. The rock was a yellowish, clay-like stone also found in New Zealand. Here and there they found small pieces of reddish, porous lava, heavily weathered, indicating a former volcano. The soil was extraordinarily fertile, likely enriched for centuries by decaying wood and plant matter. Many plant species were known from New Zealand, but showed more luxuriant growth here, such as the New Zealand flax, Phormium tenax, which grew up to 3 meters tall and bore larger, paler flowers than those in Queen Charlotte Sound. Flora and fauna combined features of New Zealand, the New Hebrides, and New Caledonia. Cypress trees from the latter grew here alongside cabbage palms from the former. The cypresses were useful to the carpenter, while the cabbage palms provided everyone with a tasty, refreshing heart that tasted more like almonds than cabbage. The wildlife also resembled that of New Zealand, but parrots here had more colorful plumage. Alongside many pigeons, there were numerous small birds, some found only here. On the beach grew succulent plants, such as a tetragonia species and a mesembryanthemum, of which they gathered plenty for soup. The song of the birds enlivened the silence of this place, which, had it been larger, might have been the best settlement site for Europeans in the South Seas. They didn't return to the ship until late in the evening, though regretting not having released pigs. In such a fertile wilderness, they would have multiplied undisturbed, and in a few years would have made the place an excellent supply station for future seafarers. Captain Cook named the island Norfolk Island. It lies at 29 degrees, 2 minutes, 30 seconds south latitude and 168 degrees, 16 minutes east longitude. While the landing party explored the forest, the boat crews discovered a tidal pool into which fish swam at high tide. The catch was successful, and these fish, along with the birds they shot and the cabbage palm hearts, supplied the crew with good meals for 2 days. The next morning, they sailed past the southern tip of the island and saw not far from it a single rock. All morning, they eagerly sounded the seabed, which still showed a depth of 55 to 73 meters, even 8 to 9 nautical miles from shore. Boobies and petrels plunged into the water in great numbers to catch fish, indicating a fish-rich sandbank. Around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, they had passed this spot and were heading with a fresh wind directly toward New Zealand, where they expected greater and more diverse supplies of fresh food. After the long stay in hot regions, Such refreshment was urgently needed. The crew had become severely weakened by the bad, half-rotten ship's provisions, and even the officers were in poor health from having eaten the poisonous fish.
That brings us to the end of this episode of Georg Forster's voyage around the world about the HMS Resolution under the command of Captain James Cook. As the expedition finally left New Caledonia behind, the crew carried with them a mixture of frustration and discovery. Illness had limited their work, and much of this vast island remained unexplored. Yet even in those few days, Georg and his companions had gathered valuable observations about its people, its landscapes, and its natural history. You can continue listening right away as the voyage unfolds step by step. If you'd like to follow the route on a map or see how these places look today, you'll find links in the YouTube show notes leading to the website. If you enjoy the podcast and would like to support my work, you'll find a PayPal link there as well. Because life is a journey, being part of it is everything.